Picture this. It's June 17th, 1930. Herbert Hoover is sitting at his desk in the Oval Office. In front of him sits a document that is exactly 887 pages long. 6 different gold pens are lined up, ready for his signature. Outside that room, the stock market has already plummeted 20% just on the rumor that he might sign it. On his desk sits a petition signed by 1,028 American economists begging him to veto it. Henry Ford has spent the entire previous night at the White House, arguing until dawn that this document is a suicide note for the global economy. Hoover picks up the first pen. He signs his name. And with that ink, he doesn't just trigger a trade war. He lights the fuse that will burn down the Weimar Republic and hand Germany to Adolf Hitler. We often think the stock market crash of 1929 caused the Great Depression. That's wrong. The crash was a spark, but the Tariff Act of 1930 was the gasoline. To understand how a tax on Swiss watches and Canadian lumber ended up creating the Third Reich, we have to go back. We have to look at the American farm. In 1920, wheat sold for $2.50 a bushel. By 1929, that same bushel sold for less than $1. American farmers were drowning in debt long before. Wall Street bankers started jumping out of windows. They demanded help. They wanted a wall built around the American market. Enter Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley. Smoot was a senator from Utah who looked at the world through the lens of sugar beets. Hawley was a representative from Oregon, obsessed with lumber prices. They drafted a bill intended to protect American farmers from foreign competition. But here's where it gets interesting. Once the door opened for tariffs, everyone wanted in. Lobbyists swarmed the Capitol hallways like locusts. A brick manufacturer wanted a tariff on imported bricks. A frantic violin maker demanded protection from German instruments. Even the makers of goldfish requested a tax on imported fish. The bill mutated. It grew from a protection plan for farmers into a monster that taxed over 20,000 imported goods. The average tariff rate on dutiable imports jumped from 15% to nearly 60%. It was an economic blockade during peacetime. Senators traded votes like baseball cards. I'll vote for your tax on Italian olive oil if you vote for my tax on Pennsylvania cement. Logic left the building. They placed tariffs on items the United States didn't even produce. We didn't grow cashews. We taxed them anyway. We didn't have a mica industry to protect. We taxed mica imports by 40%. The intent was to force Americans to buy American. The logic was simple. If we stop buying foreign goods, our factories will run at 100% capacity. But economics is not a one-way street. It is a web. And Smoot and Hawley were taking a pair of scissors to the structural supports. Which brings us back to that petition. 1,028 economists from Harvard, Columbia, and Chicago University warned Hoover. They predicted exactly 3 things would happen. First, prices for American consumers would skyrocket. Second, American exports would vanish because foreign nations would retaliate. Third, global debt structures would collapse. Hoover ignored all 3. He signed the bill at 12:59 p.m. By 1 p.m., the retaliation began. Canada was America's biggest trading partner in 1929. We bought $503 million worth of their goods. They bought $948 million of ours. When the tariff hit, the Canadian Prime Minister didn't hesitate. He raised tariffs on American goods by 50%. American car sales in Canada dropped from 45,000 units to 2,500 units in a single year. But Canada was just the first domino. Switzerland boycotted American typewriters and radios. France slammed a quota on American films. Spain placed barriers on American cars. Italy doubled duties on American cars and radios. Within 2 years, 25 nations had retaliated. World trade didn't just decline, it evaporated. In 1929, Total world trade was valued at $5.3 billion. By 1933, it had fallen to $1.8 billion. That is a 66% reduction in the movement of goods around the planet. American exports fell from $5.2 billion to $1.6 billion. The very farmers Smoot and Hawley tried to protect were the first casualties. Because nobody abroad could afford to buy American wheat anymore. U.S. farm income dropped from $12 billion in 1929 to $5 billion in 1932. Foreclosures swept the Midwest. But the economic pain in America was nothing compared to what was happening in Germany. And this is where the story turns dark. To understand why, you have to look at the Treaty of Versailles. Germany ended World War I owing 132 billion gold marks in reparations. That is roughly $269 billion in today's money. The only way Germany could pay that debt was to export goods. They had to sell steel, chemicals, and toys to America and Britain to earn the foreign currency to pay the bill. The Smoot-Hawley tariff slammed the door on German exports. German exports to the United States collapsed by 46% in 1 year. With their factories idle, they couldn't pay the reparations. With no reparations payments, the American banks that had loaned money to Germany demanded their cash back. The German banking system imploded in July 1931. Unemployment in Germany didn't just rise, it went vertical. In 1929, there were 1.3 million unemployed Germans. By 1932, that number was 6 million. That is 30% of the workforce. Picture a line of unemployed men stretching from Berlin to Munich. Now imagine that line has no food. The centrist government of Heinrich Brüning tried to fix it with austerity. It failed. People were starving. They stopped looking for economic adjustments. They started looking for a savior. In the election of 1928, before the tariff, the Nazi Party received only 2.6% of the vote. They held just 12 seats in the Reichstag. They were a fringe group of radicals screaming into the void. But misery is a powerful radicalizer. As the trade war choked off the German economy, Hitler changed his message. He stopped talking as much about pure ideology. He started talking about work and bread. He pointed to the closed factories. He pointed to the international system that seemed rigged against the German worker. And he wasn't entirely wrong about the system. The tariff was rigged against them. By July 1932, with the trade war at its peak, the Nazi Party won 37.3% of the vote. They went from 12 seats to 230 seats. They became the largest party in the parliament. Hitler didn't seize power in a vacuum. He rode a wave of economic desperation created by American protectionism. Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's Minister of Economics, later said it clearly. The United States adopted a tariff policy which made it impossible for Germany to pay. If the U.S. had kept its markets open, Germany could have sold its goods. The factories would have stayed open. The unemployment rate might have stayed at 10% instead of 30%. And a fringe agitator named Adolf Hitler might have remained a footnote in history. But the damage wasn't limited to Europe. Let's look at Japan. Japan in 1930 was desperate for raw materials. They relied on selling silk to the U.S. to buy oil and rubber. The Smoot-Hawley tariff crushed the silk market. The price of silk fell by 60%. Rural Japan was decimated. The Japanese military argued that free trade was a lie. They argued that for Japan to survive, it needed to seize resources by force. 1 year after the tariff passed, Japan invaded Manchuria. The path to Pearl Harbor was paved with trade barriers. So what happened to Smoot and Hawley? The voters held them accountable. In the 1932 election, both men lost their seats. Reed Smoot had served in the Senate for 30 years. He was unseated by a Democrat who ran almost entirely on the failure of the tariff. Willis Hawley didn't even make it to the general election. He lost his own party's primary. But the damage was done. The global economy had fractured into hostile trading blocs. The British Empire formed a closed trading loop. Germany built an autarkic war economy. The United States retreated into isolation. It took a Second World War and 60 million deaths to undo what 887 pages of legislation started. After the war, the world learned. In 1947, nations signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. Average tariffs dropped from that insane 60% peak to under 5%. Global trade exploded. From 1950 to 2000, world merchandise exports grew by 6% annually. Prosperity followed the shipping containers, but memories are short. Cycles repeat. Today, we hear the same arguments we heard in 1929. Protect our workers. Block foreign competition. Ring, the factory's back. The slogans haven't changed. And neither has the math. In 2018, the U.S. imposed new tariffs on steel and aluminum. Trading partners retaliated against $127 billion of U.S. exports. The Federal Reserve estimated these trade actions reduced U.S. employment in the manufacturing sector, the very sector they were designed to help. History is screaming at us, but are we listening? When you look at a trade war, don't just look at the price of steel. Look at the political stability of the nations you are squeezing. Look at the unemployment lines in foreign capitals. Because desperate people do desperate things. And when goods stop crossing borders, soldiers usually start. The 1028 economists were right. Hoover was wrong. And the price of that mistake wasn't paid in dollars. It was paid in blood. So here's the question for you. We are currently seeing a rise in protectionist rhetoric globally. Do you think we are resilient enough to handle a trade war today without a political collapse? Or are we one bad piece of legislation away from repeating the 1930s? Drop your prediction in the comments below. I read them all. And subscribe to see if you're right when we revisit this topic in 2026.